In the fall, this book will be published. Wonder Women is the name of the book, Sex, Power, and the Quest for Perfection. The author is Debora Spar, who also has a day job as president of Barnard College here in Manhattan. Debora Spar, are you a feminist?
You know, if you had asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not.
5 years ago?
5 years ago. But the combination of taking the job I have now and writing this book has made me a diehard feminist. Although I think the word itself is a complicated word, and I think we can get too caught up on the word itself rather than just thinking about the issues behind feminism, which I think most women are still staunchly in favor of.
Well, how do you define feminism, and what are we getting caught up on?
Well, you know, there's a great T-shirt that we have floating around at Barnard that says something to the effect of feminism is the crazy idea that women are equal to men. And I think at its core, that's really what feminism is about. And, you know, there's really no one who can argue with that anymore these days.
Where did you grow up and how did you grow up?
So I grew up outside of New York City, a fairly typical upper middle class white suburban childhood. And I grew up right in the era when feminism, in retrospect, was at its hottest. And you know, one of the things I write about in this book is that I think when you grow up during an era, in some ways you don't buy into that era's arguments because they're older than you are. So by the time I came of age, I was born in 1963, so by the time I became a teenager, really much of the great fights of feminism felt like they were over and won. And so I think many girls of my era grew up saying, I'm not a feminist. Thank you very much to all the women who came before us. I'm delighted I can go to an Ivy League college. I'm delighted I can play sports in high school. I'm delighted I have the pill, but I don't see those struggles as being something that I'm personally invested in because they're over already.
How important was Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique? And that came out in '63,
Right, that came out the year I was born. You know, I had zero knowledge of it growing up. It didn't affect my life in any way.
Did your mother read it, do you remember?
My mother read it, but I don't think it affected her life in any huge way because she was, in retrospect, already quite liberated. She was a school teacher. She was very vivacious, is still very vivacious. So I didn't read Betty Friedan. Certainly not as a kid. I didn't read it in college. And I really have only read it much later in life. And was in fact quite shocked to see how, first of all, it's a brilliant book, but also how relevant it is in the sense that I think although women have won legal rights, workplace rights, great numbers since 1963, a lot of the problems she points to are still problems we're dealing with today.
Debora Spar, you started by saying that ever since you took the job as president of Barnard College that you've become a diehard feminist. Why?
And I think to be probably a little clearer, I started becoming a feminist, although I wouldn't have really used that word earlier in my life when I was at Harvard University and Harvard Business School. And I think what happened, and I've seen this happen to so many women of my age, is that as we got older and as we grew into our marriages and grew into our professional lives, we started to realize that our lives as women were evolving differently than were the men's lives we saw around us. And just, you know, to be blunt, that women's lives are still harder in many ways and more complicated than their male counterparts, particularly if they're women who are trying to do what feminism promised, which was balance family, career, husbands, loves, and all the richness of a life.
Don't men do that?
I think men do it differently. And I think, you know, one of the things we haven't really seen yet societally is a repositioning of men's roles. But I think men have always, or certainly through modern history, been aware of the fact that their primary job is to have a career, to bring home the bacon, to be the provider for their families, and to spend time with their families as a father role. But they feel less of a compulsion to be perfect dads and perfect husbands and to devote themselves to their family life as much as to their work life. I think what's befallen women of my generation and younger is what I call in this book the double or triple whammy of expectations. That as women, we've retained all of the expectations that surround motherhood and wifehood, and we've added to them all of the expectations of a professional life and an athletic life and all of these other things. So we are trying simultaneously to be perfect wives and mothers and perfect career women. And I think men have done a better job of not trying to do everything at once.
Debora Spar, if you had been born in '53 rather than '63, how different would your life be?
That's a great question, and I can't really tell, but just looking at women who I see as being like myself but 10 years older, I think I would have encountered feminism earlier in my life. If I had been born in 1953, I would have been in college in 1968, which probably would have been a little later than that, 1970, probably would have been a more interesting time to be in college. But women who were in college in the late 60s and early 70s almost inevitably did get caught up with the feminist movement. Whereas it's funny, only 10 years later, when I went to college in 1980, it was the Reagan years. You know, activism on college campuses was generally dead, and certainly activism around feminism was dead.
Who is Helene, or is Helene Kaplan?
Helene Kaplan is an amazing woman, very well known in the city of New York. She was one of the first women to become a lawyer at one of the a partner at one of the major New York law firms. Went back to law school after she had had her second child and after she had gotten her children over the primary school years, and she's been a real role model for me. She's an amazing woman.
In 1955, you write, 2 years after graduating with honors from Barnard, she was married to a man she loved deeply. She had one infant daughter sleeping in the pram and a second, only slightly older, toddling beside. Suddenly walking with her daughters and husband in Central Park, she sat down on a bench and began to weep. I was only 24, she recalls, and my whole life was ruined. I cried to my husband that as much as I loved my girls, I had always wanted to be a lawyer.
And she did, and she went back and became a lawyer and still is a practicing lawyer and grandmother.
Debora Spar, you write about being raised in the Charlie era. What does that mean?
Well, most women, and I suspect most men of my generation, remember a commercial that ran in the late 1960s for Charlie perfume. It was also the same time that Charlie's Angels hit the airwaves on television. And so there was a lot of Charlie in the ether. And both the Charlie's Angels, clearly, and the Charlie perfume ads portrayed women in this, in retrospect, fantastical way. They were gorgeous, of course. They clearly had careers. They clearly had men in their lives. In one of the ads I remember for Charlie perfume, the woman also had a child in her life in rather a sort of peripheral way, because the child was sort of there, but the woman was clearly going to work. And I really think that Charlie, both the perfume ads and the TV show, created a subconscious expectation in women of my era that somehow this was the kind of life we would lead, that we would be gorgeous for all of our lives, that we would find men easily, that we would find sexual opportunities easily, that we'd have careers and babies and great shoes on the side. And I think girls my age really just grew up, for the first time in history, presuming that all these things would be ours.
And
it didn't turn out to be true, because of course it was a television ad and a television fantasy show, and it wasn't true. But I think it did create these deep-seated expectations that really have been perpetuated to this day.
this is an autobiography, isn't it?
It's in part. The book wound up being far more autobiographical than I expected it to be.
What was that process like for you to write this?
It was hard. I've written several books before. They've all been pure academic-y books. And so putting my own life on paper was hard, but it was very useful and cathartic in some respects to sort of understand sort of what the forces that have molded me.
Are you giving future students at Barnard ammunition when you write this? One of the best jobs I ever had was at the YMCA. I got to spend an inordinate amount of time lounging around the pool in a swimsuit and learn vital lessons from my fellow male swim instructors, like what blue balls really felt like and how to bake a good hash brownie.
I'm not sure that particular passage is designed to be advisory, but I think it does capture, we've all been teenagers, and there's certain things that tend to accompany that stage of life.
Do you regret teaching 9-year-olds how to play spin the bottle, as you write about?
I'm not sure in retrospect I would have taught 9-year-olds how to play spin the bottle, but for the historical record I will say that none of them actually really was so brave as to risk a kiss.
Debora Spar, what do you want people to take away from Wonder Women?
I want women in particular, both young women and older women, to walk away from this book with a sigh of relief, to be able to say, okay, I'm not perfect, I'm not a Wonder Woman, but nobody is. And that I have more power in my own life to make choices that make me happy, that bring me joy, rather than constantly feeling, as I think so many women do, both my students and older women, that they've got to be everything to all people at all times.
Former professor at Harvard Business School, president of Barnard College. What is a glass ceiling? What does that term mean to you?
I think the glass ceiling is a great term that captures the sense of frustration that many women feel